Open up your Bibles to the book of Hosea, and we'll be looking there in just a moment, as Garrett suggested. I appreciate him leading that song, and it does take a number of phrases from the book of Hosea, and we'll be considering those this morning. The book of Hosea starts out with one of the more memorable stories, illustrations in all of the prophets. Particularly memorable because of how intensely it involves the prophet himself. So when you open up the book of Hosea, you are stunned to find that God is telling one of his godly prophets to go marry a harlot, and to not just marry her, but then continue to go after her again and again, though again and again she shows unfaithfulness, even producing children of unfaithfulness. But go and bring her back. And intermingled with all of that is God's own poetry and his own efforts to continue to woo his unfaithful wife back. And of course, that's what it illustrates, is that Israel is unfaithful to God, and here he is on the other end of that relationship. And so he is asking Hosea to do what he has already done so that the people could look at that, so that they could see that. And certainly Hosea got to see that more deeply than any other. So because of that really beautiful story, we might often focus on the first three chapters and be more inclined to leave off chapters 4 through 14. The last time through the Old Testament, I preached a lesson on the first three chapters. I want to suggest that the remaining chapters, 4 through 14, are really a detailed spelling out of how those first three chapters illustrate the reality. So that's what this looks like symbolically. Here's what it looks like literally. Here's what's actually going on. And let me spell all that out for the people. And so I want to begin there in chapter 4, and we'll be looking at what it has to say about God and his relationship here. Let's see here. All right. Okay. So, as was read for us there in chapter 11, we see the picture of a lion, and we will see how God is depicted as a lion. We will see maybe more than one way in which God was depicted as a lion throughout the story of Hosea. Well, beginning here in chapter 4, as I said, what we have is God giving clarity to that situation of Israel's unfaithfulness versus his faithful husbandry of them. And so in verse 1, it says, "Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land, because there is no faithfulness or kindness." I've said many times that the prophets are full of legal language. And this is certainly legal language. He has a case, an indictment is one way that this word is translated. He has a complaint against the children of Israel. And so he's going to lay out his case. He's going to make his case against Israel. Now, one of the things that I say about that frequently is that God doesn't have to lay out his case, right? He could just say they are guilty. But over and over through the prophets, for the sake of those to whom the prophet was speaking at that time, and also for the sake of those who would be reading about this many years later, that they could look back and not just see that God, who would be right to pronounce their guilt with no evidence except for his testimony, does give testimony, does bring into evidence what makes them guilty. And so he really gives us even more confidence in him than I think he is obliged to give. But I think what's interesting in all of these cases is that God is coming in the place of the accuser, which is a peculiar place for God to be in the way that we generally think about him. In fact, he is, in our minds, the advocate, and he is the advocate. But he is also, in these places, the accuser. And so he is the one that is making the case against Israel. That is interesting. The word Satan, some of you may know, actually means accuser or adversary. But God can put himself in that role on occasion. Over in Numbers chapter 22. In Numbers chapter 22, you remember the story of Balaam, where Balaam was enticed to go and to prophesy against Israel, to curse them. And after being told not to go, not to accept that invitation, he asked again, and God tells him in his displeasure that he may go. He goes along, and you remember the donkey turning to the side and so forth. And on the final straw with the donkey, it says in verse 22, "But God was angry because he was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. Now he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his sword drawn in his hand, the donkey turned off from the way and went to the field. But Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back into the way." So here, God himself places the angel of the Lord, which is a term full of meaning. That is the representation of the Lord himself, as an adversary. That word in verse 22, as an adversary against him, is the word Satan. Now that's really hard for us to swallow. That the angel of the Lord stood as Satan against him, as the accuser. That's the idea. He stood as someone who was against Balaam, against what Balaam was doing. I think God does take up that role sometimes. But we'll see he does not take it up in the same way that Satan, the accuser, takes up that role. And we'll see those differences as we go along in the lesson. But coming back to Hosea chapter 4, he says in the latter portion of the verse, because this is the reason God is making his case, or this is the case against Israel, because there is no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land. And I think that really most everything else that follows from here through chapter 13 really, because chapter 14 really gets into the redemptive portion. But from chapters 4 through 13, the case is being made that these three things, these three aspects are the problem: faithlessness, lack of kindness, and lack of knowledge of God in the land. First of all, looking at that idea of the lack of faithfulness. The word adultery or harlotry occur more frequently in the book of Hosea than any other book in the Old Testament, by a factor of like 4, right? So 4 or maybe 5 times as much as the next book. Ezekiel would be the closest. Like there's a lot of talk about harlotry and adultery in Ezekiel as well. But they mean the same thing, in fact, in Ezekiel and Hosea, that it is certainly inclusive of literal adultery, but mostly it's talking about idolatry. And we see that throughout the text in verse 12. "My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them, for a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God." So most particularly, it's unfaithfulness to their reliance on God, to putting God before all else. Now, one of the things that you see with the nation of Israel is we try to reflect on idolatry, which is a crime that is foreign to us in so many ways, from the standpoint of practicing idolatry with an image that we set up and bow down to it. That's not in our wheelhouse. So we look at idolatry and maybe we don't feel like this is a problem. And so we have to think about it in terms of what we put in place of the trust that we owe God. In so many ways, what we got to do is whatever we put, what we should get from God, when we get that from somewhere else, that's idolatry. Where do you get comfort that should come from God from somewhere else? Do you get pleasure that should come from God? That's not to say that you can't have comfort and pleasure from other things as long as you recognize them. You know, when Jesus says his model prayer in Matthew chapter 6, "Give us this day our daily bread," we get comfort from food. But there must be a recognition, as Paul points out in 1 Timothy 4, there must be a recognition it is sanctified when when we give thanks to the one from whom those things come. So there's got to be always a recognition of where God is in the midst of where our good things come from. Understand, these are people who did not just write out God entirely. They simply mingled him in to trusting the other gods as well, right? So that they just became pantheists. They have room for God, but not God alone. And of course, God will only be looked at as God alone. He will not share space with the other gods to whom these people would pledge fealty. That works out a little bit more clear and maybe a little bit more close in our association as we look at their trust in the nations around them. And that's also highlighted as their adultery. In Hosea chapter 7 and verse 11, it says, "So Ephraim has become like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria." Down in chapter 8 and in verse 9, it says, "For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers." And so there you see that sort of adultery language, that going after the other nations, that's cheating on God. Why? Because again, that kind of speaks to what we were talking about before. They're trusting the other nations instead of God. Now that starts to hit home really close, I hope. Because in a time where we are looking for some stability and some confidence, a lot of people, maybe not trusting in other nations, maybe somehow trying to trust in our nation. If we just get the right guy in place, all this will be fixed. It's just not true. There is no ultimate trust in the leaders of men. Whether they be our own leaders or foreign leaders, it does not matter. But if you put them in place and you put confidence in them that should alone be placed in God, then it is unfaithfulness. And so we need to see that we can be guilty of the sorts of unfaithfulness, the sorts of harlotry that he's speaking of here. Of course, their moral bankruptcy, their moral ignorance, I say ignorance, their rejection of God's morality is also unfaithfulness. We'll talk about that more under the category of knowledge in just a moment. Well, secondly, he says there is no kindness. Now, this word kindness is an interesting word. Down in chapter 4 and verse 4, chapter 4 and verse 4, he says, "Let no one find fault and let none offer reproof." This is, that should be chapter 6 and verse 4. That's the passage I'm going for here. We'll come back to 4 and 4. Chapter 6 and verse 4, it says, "What shall I do with you, Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty is like a morning cloud, and like the dew which goes away early." That word loyalty is the same word as kindness back in chapter 4 and verse 1. I don't know about you, but like if somebody said, "Give me all the synonyms you can think of for kindness," like loyalty is not one of the ones I'm going to pull out of my pocket. I'm thinking, and the other way around, somebody says, "Give me all the synonyms you can think of for loyalty." Kindness is not where my mind goes. But somehow, there's a range of meaning in this word that means loyalty and means kindness. How can that be so? I think there's a little bit of help a couple of verses down in verse 6. In a verse there that is a little bit more familiar to us. In the New American Standard, it translates it, "For I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." Now, you know that is quoted over in Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12 and in verse 7, there on that occasion where the disciples of Jesus had been walking through the field and plucking the heads of grain as they went to quench their hunger, and they are judged by the Pharisees as having broken the law of the Sabbath, even though they had explicitly not broken the law of the Sabbath. They had broken the traditions created by the Pharisees. But Jesus' conclusion in his rebuke to them in verse 7 is a quotation of Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. It says, "But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion." Now he uses that word here. "I desire compassion and not sacrifice." Mercy, some of your translations might say. And if you'd known this, if you'd known what this means, you would not have condemned the innocent. So we've got kindness, compassion, mercy, loyalty. I think, especially as I look at chapter 12, who is the loyalty to? Who is the kindness to? If it was just loyalty, we would think, well, loyalty to God first. But the kindness and the mercy and the compassion doesn't make us think like, you ought to be more compassionate. Yes, I know that I should be more compassionate with God. That just doesn't, that's not generally the direction we are showing mercy and compassion. That's usually to each other. And so that leads me back to that notion of loyalty. I certainly think it would be inclusive of loyalty to God, and maybe even kindness to God. But I think primarily what God is speaking of in Hosea chapter 6 is a loyalty to each other. And particularly, it's a willingness to show that kindness and compassion and mercy that is sustained. Go back again to chapter 6 of Hosea and verse 4, where he says your loyalty or kindness or loving kindness, this is often translated, is like a morning cloud and like the dew which goes away early. It's that idea of something that lasts, that you're going to stick with it. And these people do not stick with it. They're so flighty. They're so easily distracted from their commitment of kindness to each other and of sticking with each other, sticking by each other. They sell each other out cheaply, as Amos would have put it, and in so many ways as Hosea would put it. But there should be that sustained fervor, not just generally for God, but for his people. The phrase there, or the word there, loyalty, is also translated loving kindness. His loving kindness is everlasting. We looked at that psalm not too long ago. You see how it puts it together with that notion that his loving kindness, it lasts. He stays with it. God's love, his loyalty to you doesn't go anywhere. He maintains it. Well, back over in chapter 4. In chapter 4 and verse 4, he says, let no one find fault. Let none offer reproof. For your people are like those who contend with the priest. You know, I think there's an indication that maybe some of the people say, well, let's get on this. You know, he's got these charges, these indictments, and so let's bring people to the stand. And he says, no. Who do you think you are? You are in no position to tell anybody else. I'm telling each one of you. And so this is not take these indictments and start pointing fingers. It's you have no right to find fault, to go reprove another. And then he says, for your people are like those who contend with the priest, which is an interesting phrase and offers a little bit of difficulty, but maybe it's a reference back here to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 12, where Moses writes that the man who acts presumptuously by not listening to the priest who stands there to serve the Lord your God, nor to the judge, that man shall die. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. Then all the people will hear and be afraid and will not act presumptuously again. The idea is when you bring your case to the priest and the judge who are there appointed by God, then you ought to respect what they would say about it. And I think the idea here is, don't you go pointing fingers, because if you brought them before the priest, you would not like the result. You wouldn't even accept it. So these people, they're not loyal to each other. They're not kind and merciful to each other. And so they cannot even take up the Lord's cause with each other. Over in chapter 7 and in verse 4. Chapter 7 and verse 4. The idea, I think, behind all of this, we ought to have a burning passion for each other. Not against each other, but for each other. And in chapter 7, and beginning in verse 4, he uses an illustration of an oven. He says, they are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker. who ceases to stir up the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. On the day of our king, the princes became sick with the heat of wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers, for their hearts are like an oven as they approach their plotting. Their anger smolders all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. All of them are hot like an oven, and they consume their rulers, and their kings have fallen. None of them calls to me. Ephraim mixes himself with the nations. Ephraim has become a cake not turned. Now that cake not turned is familiar to some, and some might phrase it, Ephraim has become half-baked. And I think that's not entirely wrong, but it's worse than that. They're burnt on one side and entirely uncooked on the other. As we go through that illustration, he sort of builds on it like an oven heated, and he comes back and says you're like an oven again, and then verse 7, you're like a hot oven again. And the idea is that they just they first of all, they build the fire and they just let it stew. They let it simmer there in the oven. And then it again in verse 6, that they approach their plotting and they let it smolder all night, and then it flames out during the day. And then their passions cause them to consume their rulers. And of course, a lot of that was going on here as we are nearing the end of the northern kingdom. And they rise up against a king and kill this one, and then another comes to his place, and then they rise up and they kill him. And so their passions are just flowing one after another. And I really think that that's the context into which we come to verse 8, where he says you've become a cake not turned. That is, you've let your passions burn well beyond anything appropriate until you've burnt that side of the cake completely up. And then on the other side, you're completely raw. You've got no passion. I think this is a good illustration of our culture. That we get so worked up and flamed up on one side, way beyond any good sense or morality, and then the same people on the other side, I mean, the things that they're not upset about, that there's no passion about, all in the same person. There's no balance. There's no sensibility. It's too much here, not enough here. It's useless. And that's what they are, is useless. That's what he's describing here. He goes on, of course, to pick up there and say that they're so confused, like the dove that we read about earlier, the silly dove who is without sense. Well, not only is there no kindness or loyalty, there is no knowledge. As we look back there in chapter 4 and verse 6, maybe one of the most well-known passages from Hosea, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your Lord or of your God, I will also forget your children. Notice it is that they have rejected his law, not that it was not available to them. Over in chapter 8 and in verse 12, he writes this, though I write for him 10,000 precepts of my law, they are regarded as a strange thing. I certainly think as a society, that's where people are. I don't know how many times I've been talking with someone and you bring a passage up and they might say, "What? No, surely that's not in the Bible." No, that's there. Can I tell you, I have that conversation with Christians sometimes too. Where people are just so certain in what they believe the path forward is, and you just want to say, but where are you getting that from? And they're so certain because what they've done is they've allowed themselves to be trained by the world, to be continually, gradually, little by little, brought into a worldly way of thinking from one direction or another. What is the result? Well, chapter 5 and verse 10 says, the princes of Judah have become like those who move a boundary. And I think that's that idea right there, the moving of the boundary. You know, God sets things in place and then we nudge it over just a little bit. I just recently got a completed survey done on some property we bought, and he said it was going to take about a week, and that was a 30-day week apparently. So one of the things that happened is that landmarks were moved. Now, not technically they weren't moved, but rather what would happen is somebody just thought they were pretty sure their property line was here, so that's where they built the fence. And then the person next to them said, well, that must be right, and so then I'm going to build my fence based on what they built their fence. And so this guy had to do a lot of research to kind of set it all back straight and say, no, here's where your property is. And so that took a while. Well, I think we have the same thing, right? People just go about assuming, and then before long, it's pretty traditional. They say, this is what we do. So, well, that's what we've always done, and if that's right, let's not go back and check it, let's just assume, then this must be right. And we begin to build really incredibly large structures on the basis of an assumption that somebody made a long time ago. But what do? Well, you go back. And it may take a while. You may have to do a lot of research. And it may make some people upset who had their fences and a whole lot of other things built where they ought not to have been built. What happens? They got to tear them down. You can't have stuff that's not on your property. And so we have to go back and we have to see what the boundaries were to begin with. So they become like those who move a boundary. He says, on them I will pour out my wrath like water. Ephraim, he says, is oppressed and crushed in judgment. Why? Because he was determined to follow man's command. Because when we go about thinking that we have solutions, especially when we think we have political solutions, if we give enough power to the right men, we'll get it fixed. No, as long as that's our mentality, Ephraim is oppressed and crushed. That's the result. Because men don't know. Men are silly doves who run around looking to each other for solutions. Well, he says, in the result of all this, let him alone. In chapter 4 and verse 17, Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Now, what does that mean? Well, it sounds pretty harsh. Just leave him be. And in some sense, I think that is right. I don't think it's the idea of don't appeal to him, right? Don't try to bring him back, because that's the very thing God is sending Hosea to do, is not leave him alone in that sense. Go try to teach the truth. I think the idea of leave him alone is don't go over there and be sucked in by what he's doing. You keep your distance. Morally speaking, you keep your distance, influence speaking. You let him live that life, but don't think that you've got to somehow entangle yourself with it. I think that's our difficult responsibility of being in the world, but not of the world. And in some ways, while we are trying to appeal to the world, while we're trying to bring the world near, all the while, I think we've got to have this mentality, leave them alone. Leave their wickedness alone. Leave their philosophies alone. Let them be. Our interaction should be to bring light, not entangle ourselves. And so, God says of Israel. One of the things that Hosea is doing, incidentally, is that he is, in addition to condemning the northern kingdom, he is making an appeal in a sideways manner to the southern kingdom. And I think maybe they are among those who ought to leave Ephraim alone. Well, then comes the lion. We have a few passages in which God is referred to as a lion in the text. In Hosea chapter 5 and verse 14, Hosea chapter 5 and verse 14, it says, "For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, like a young lion to the house of Judah. I, even I, will tear to pieces and go away. I will carry away, and there will be none to deliver." Over in chapter 13, And in verse 7, he uses several animals as imagery here, but all to the same effect. So he says, I will be like a lion to them, like a leopard. I will lie in wait by the wayside. I will encounter them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open their chests. There I will also devour them like a lioness, as a wild beast would tear them. The imagery of the lion is used more frequently in Hosea than any of the other prophets. We notice some of that imagery back in Amos, but it's even more so here in Hosea. But this lion is not always prowling about in the same way. In chapter 11, as Travis read for us earlier, beginning in verse 8, God says, in the midst of all this talk of judgment, he says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst. I will not come in wrath, for they will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. To what effect? Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. So you got on the one hand, God saying, I'm going to rip these people to pieces like a lion. And then you have God saying, I am going to roar like a lion, but what I mean is for it to be a wake-up call. And for people to say, let's go home. Let's go home to where the lion waits to protect us. But sometimes God has to tear in order to get the attention. In fact, I think all the time God has to tear. In chapter 6, we have some of those words that we sang before the sermon. He says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us. And that word torn is most often associated with a lion. One occasion it's associated with a wolf, but it's the idea of a wild animal coming and tearing someone to pieces. So he has torn us, but he will heal us. He has wounded us, but he will bandage us. He will revive us after 2 days. He will raise us up on the third day, that we may live before him. So let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going forth is as certain as the dawn, and he will come to us like the rain, like the spring rain watering the earth. Just a beautiful picture there. At the beginning of the lesson, I made an association of God being the accuser. Here again is an association. James says that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Here's God saying, I'm the lion in this case. And I'm prowling around, and I want to devour you. But what is the nature of that? Well, the nature of that is he would have that be that we become a part of him. But I want to suggest to you, becoming a part of him is painful. And it does involve him in some measure, as he talks about there in chapter 13, tearing open our chests, shredding our hearts, so that he can put them back together. Because they're a mess. They're all out of joint. And he says, I've got to do surgery, and it's going to hurt. But he says, he's torn us, but he will heal us. How do you accept the tearing of the Lord? There is one of C.S. Lewis's stories that is lesser known, is the the horse and his boy. And in that story, the boy is running away from his captors. And during the night, he has been chased by a lion. And at one point, the lion reaches out and rakes his back. And he has scars the next day, and he's wounded. And later, he's telling Aslan about that. And Aslan is representative of Jesus in those stories. And he says, that's me. That was me. And wouldn't you rather take my claws, which are measured in the way that they tear, than the people who were coming behind you? You weren't running fast enough. And so I motivated you. And those scars saved you. And so when someone gets up and they preach hard and it hurts and we feel torn, listen to Jesus saying, I am tearing you on purpose. That's not an accident. So that you can come near and you can find a way to put that back together that will be of value to you. I hope that if you're here and you need to be torn, that you would let him tear your heart open. That you'd let him do what damage needs to be done. And then come to the accuser who also is your advocate. The lion who tears, who is also the lion who protects. You see, in using that imagery for the devil, he tears you to leave you sitting there for dead. God tears you so that he can keep you from dying. And so I hope that you might answer that call, that you might respond to that invitation this day. If there's any way that we can help you, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?